The last few years have brought an explosion of strange discoveries about the neuroscience of consciousness. It seems like scientists are always finding some new technique for turning memories on or off, turning emotions up or down, and even hitting the off and on switch for conscious awareness itself. When you hear about these discoveries, it makes you wonder, how long until we have a real theory of consciousness, the same way we have a theory of gravity and a theory of evolution? How long will it be until we can clearly lay out what consciousness is and how it works in objective, scientific, mathematical terms? A lot of neuroscientists are working on this question, and a lot of philosophers are putting out books about it too. And that kind of adds to the confusion, doesn't it? Is this a neuroscience question? Is this a philosophy question? Is it a little bit of both? You know, where do these fields intersect? And what does the bleeding edge of hardcore consciousness research really look like right now? What questions are they asking? What answers are they finding? You know, what's changing and what's new? My guest today on episode 14 of the Connectome Podcast is a researcher who's spent his entire career right on that bleeding edge of consciousness research. And I'll tell you, if you think that field is all abstractions and philosophy, man, this guy is about to set you straight with some hard data right from the front lines. His name is Bernard Baars, and he has been a leading figure in consciousness research since at least the late 80s, and he's still right at the forefront of the field. And I actually met him when he wrote a commentary on my article, A Disease of Scienciness, which is another topic that he's hugely passionate about. And so Bernard Baars, let me just welcome you to the Connectome Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, you're a neuroscientist who studies consciousness rather than a philosopher of consciousness. And I think that's an important distinction, because it kind of separates, right, people like you and, you know, Michael Gazzaniga and Joseph Ledoux from guys like Dan Dennett and Douglas Hofstadter and philosophers of consciousness. Now, in your eyes, what's the distinction between those two types of approaches to the study of consciousness?
That's a simple one. It comes down to evidence. I think evidence is all important when you ask a question about consciousness. And I am one of the first people, at least, to propose something called contrastive analysis, which is just using consciousness as an experimental or observational variable in as precise a way as you can do that. That literature took off in the 90s and has just accelerated, so that by now my usual way of saying it is that if you go to the huge medical database PubMed on the web and you simply type in conscious brain, that you get thousands and thousands of hits. Quite a few of those are substantive. They really add to our understanding of the conscious brain. And of course, one can approach it psychologically, one can approach it introspectively for that matter. And then we have this quite wonderful, huge wave of increasingly good brain recordings of what's happening when we're conscious and also when we're not conscious of something.
Yeah, for example, I saw a study that came out last year, you might have seen this, on an epileptic woman. Researchers claimed that they were actually able to disrupt this woman's conscious awareness and then bring it back again by delivering small bursts of electricity directly into her claustrum, that brain structure that's long been suspected to play a major role in consciousness. And each time they sent electricity into her claustrum, they say, she remained awake and responsive. Her eyes were open, she responded to touch, and so on. But she lost conscious awareness. She wasn't consciously aware that she was having these experiences. And they knew this because when they turned off, the electrical stimulation, her consciousness came back. The light came back into her eyes, but she had no memory of the past few minutes.
I think that was the case history, is that correct?
Right, it was just that single patient.
Right. Claustrum has been an interesting topic of debate since Francis Crick and Christoph Koch suggested that it might be sort of I wouldn't say the location of consciousness, but perhaps the location of conscious content, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And we still haven't figured out exactly what the claustrum does in terms of consciousness. And that touches on an important point. Research on consciousness seems to fall into two major, you could call them schools of thought or approaches these days. One approach, you could call it the traditional approach, is to stick electrodes in the brain or work with patients who've had certain brain areas surgically removed and try to figure out what's missing from their mind as a result. Right, so you can start to pinpoint the brain structures associated with specific things consciousness does. And then we have this newer approach, the connectomic approach, where data scientists are trying to reconstruct certain small chunks of the brain and do that neuron by neuron inside a computer with the goal of eventually, in the long term, simulating a complete brain from scratch and understanding consciousness in effect by reverse engineering it. Now, do you think that those two approaches are complementary, or do they represent two divergent paths?
Oh, I think it's all complementary. I think the Blue Brain Project overstated its aims, and the scientists who were involved with it were unhappy about that. What we're getting beautiful evidence for right now, which is my favorite literature, is very often done in epileptic patients who need surgery to stop intractable epilepsy by cutting out the focus in the cortex, typically in the temporal lobe, of the epileptic storm. And if that can be done cleanly, then you can actually stop the epilepsy or at least improve it. So those patients by now are being brain recorded for several days, let's say, prior to surgery in order to make sure that you get the right spot and also to make sure that you do not damage the language areas particularly. So during that time, they are normal. They sleep and wake in a perfectly normal way. And so we can observe the brain with amazing accuracy, 1,000 times better than the scalp EEG. And we see all kinds of phenomena that were unsuspected 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Even today, there are neuroscientists and others who don't happen to know that literature, who think the best that we can do is slap some electrodes on somebody's head. Well, there are things you can do that way, but direct brain recording is 1,000 times better. Just the signal to noise ratio. So we're seeing all kinds of phenomena that look totally new.
What's an example of a totally new phenomenon?
Well, the traditional characterization of the waking brain of consciousness is that the EEG, which is always scalp EEG, is fast, irregular, and small. It's low in voltage. The reason for that is that you lose 99.9% of the voltage in going from the brain to the outside of the scalp. That's why the voltage is low. And when you suddenly can record directly from cortex, you see activity in small patches, for example, of Broca's area and Wernicke's area when the patient is speaking, which is the traditional 19th century view based on brain damage. Because when you're speaking, you're also listening. And Wernicke's area is a good chunk of the auditory cortex, and Broca's area is associated with speech and, in general, voluntary control. So now we can actually see the bursting of small populations of neurons in those two huge areas, and we can see that they resonate with each other. So from an oscillatory point of view, they are linked with each other. They oscillate together, or they disrupt oscillation. We're just beginning to see a whole wide vocabulary of oscillatory signaling in the brain. The typical thing people talk about these days has a lower rhythm of about the theta wave, 4 to 7 hertz, but roughly around 10 hertz. And then it has bursts of very high gamma, up to 200 hertz. This is very much like AM or FM radio, where the carrier wave seems to be the lower one, let's say at 10 hertz, and the signaling wave seems to ride on top of the carrier wave. That is a first glance description, but it's generally the way people talk about it. That's very different. There are global phenomena in the cortex associated with consciousness, but these are impressive because they're so well characterized both spatially and temporally and in terms of frequency. So these are phenomena that are washed out with conventional EEG because the signal's too low and it gets averaged out over all the different locations. If you imagine these little patches of cortex that are talking to each other with direct brain recording, if you can imagine 1,000 of those patches all talking at the same time, talking to each other, cortex talking to corresponding patches in the thalamus, and then doing output via the basal ganglia, all that stuff gets mushed together on conventional EEG so that we get a very distant roar of the crowd, but we don't get the specific conversations between crowd members. And that's now beginning to happen in a very beautiful way.
So we're actually starting to pinpoint the frequencies on which specific brain areas transmit information to each other. We're watching different brain areas literally tune in to each other's broadcasts as we tune in to specific frequencies on the radio. And it's incredible to me. It means we may be on the verge of actually parsing out specific transmissions inside the brain. It's fascinating to think that one of the most mysterious phenomena in the universe may have such a clear, down-to-earth counterpart in our daily experience. Now, to change gears a little bit, let's talk about how this consciousness research grabbed you personally. You really came on the scene in 1988 when you published your book, A Cognitive Theory of Consciousness. What was it about this field that first pulled you in?
If we were in a fully rational world, which we're not, you would basically shrug your shoulders and say, well, it's one of the fundamentals. We've looked at information processing, we've looked at gravity in physics, we've looked at every fundamental question in the natural world, and for curious ideological reasons, we've skipped the big one, the one that Aristotle talked about, and that the Indian tradition and the Chinese tradition talks about in sort of an obsessive way. And they're very sophisticated ideas, as you know, coming from all the great traditions regarding consciousness. And for scientists who avoid that is bizarre. So part of the answer is because it's there and because it's a great opportunity from a scientific point of view to be able to tackle one of the great questions of history.
Was the path always that clear for you? Was it really as simple as, this is a fundamental question, I will now study it? Was it really that straightforward?
No, I was trained as an experimental psychologist, a cognitive psychologist, and I was very much interested in the debate going on at that time between radical behaviorism of the Skinner type and a more relaxed theoretical approach that allowed you to make inferences based on behavior, which opened up what was called at that time the cognitive revolution in psychology. And the cognitive revolution was really just the ability to use your behavioral data to make inferences about the underlying constructs In other words, to explain and theorize in a way that was not directly testable at the time because we didn't have the brain measures, but indirectly testable, just as astronomy. The growth of astronomy goes back a couple thousand years, of course, but people for a long time have felt free to postulate inferred theoretical concepts to explain the orbits of the planets as they're seen from Earth. That was one of the great theoretical questions, but nobody, as far as I know, in the history of astronomy ever said you can't do that. You can't postulate the existence of these wandering points in the night sky, but rather all we can do is describe the observations very, very literally down to where you point your telescope and what the time is and so on. You need that data, but you also need to make inferences. And when that debate got settled, dealing with consciousness as a theoretical concept was just a matter of making inferences from the evidence that you have, really quite strong inferences, explanatory stories. And that's what global workspace theory does, along with other theories that largely converge with each other.
And one of those theories was your global workspace theory of consciousness, which really put you on the map as a consciousness researcher. That theory is why I first got into your work. It's a fascinating idea. The basic concept for people who are listening is that consciousness isn't a single contiguous entity at all. It's a viewpoint. And there's this whole swarm of functions buzzing around in our brains all the time, and most of them ordinarily sit in the audience and sort of watch other functions on the center stage of consciousness. But any function in that swarm can gain access to the center stage, the viewpoint of first-person conscious experience, for a limited time under the right conditions. So I've got this whole swarm of different semi-independent functions flying around in my brain, and each of those functions can occupy the stage, the experience of being me, for a few moments, and then hand over that experience of being me in the first person to another function in the swarm, which takes over for the next few moments, and so on and so on. It's like each one of us is, on an individual level, a self-contained hive mind.
Right now, I'm increasingly interested in the audience as a swarm, if you will, or a crowd. And among the crowd, let's say there are 1,000 areas of cortex that can receive information from whatever is conscious at a given time. Among those cortical regions, there are some that support precisely the notion of self that you just described, the self as a inferred viewpoint. So if you're a baby and you're learning to crawl, you're actually making inferences about all kinds of things, of course, but one of the things that you need to know is where you are located. And it's interesting when you ask people, where is your I, where is your self located in the visual field, they will tend to point to about an inch in back of the ridge of your nose. And that is, of course, empirically not true, but it is a necessary assumption to have an origin, a 0 point, for your visual space. And that concept has been around among vision researchers for quite a long time, so that now you're a baby again and you're crawling on the carpet toward a red ball, and you have to know what is the distance between me and that attractive red ball. So the baby goes up to it and bumps into it, and that's information that tells the baby, now I'm too close to it. So with thousands of exploratory experiments and play and so on, babies build a conception of the sensory motor self, but also increasingly the social self and so on, so that by 4 years of age, children become self-conscious and start to have self-conscious emotions such as shame and pride. Those are at least two of the biggies that have to do with Am I being wonderful from a social point of view, that's to say, the viewpoint of other people, or am I being dreadful from a social point of view, meaning the point of view of mom and dad and the other kids?
So from a neurological perspective, the self isn't a single entity that grows as our bodies grow. It's a construct generated by a whole system of interconnected programs in our brains, all of which are constantly inferring things about the self based on their own various ways of reacting to the world around us, and kind of generating the self on the fly. And this idea of the self, and this is such a crucial distinction, is the self is a completely different thing from the actual experience of being conscious in the first person.
Right, and we've gotten just gorgeous data on that kind of process with advances in, I think I should call them brain recording techniques, because it's not just imagery, although we're such visual creatures, of course, that images are very powerful for us. But we have brain recording techniques that, as I mentioned, the best one today is simply placing a grid of electrodes almost directly on cortex or any other part of the brain, and simply recording from electrodes that might be, let's say, 5 millimeters apart. And if you have a 6 by 6 array, that gives you 64 points you can record from. For epilepsy surgery, you typically place the grid on the left hemisphere because that's the area where you want to be the most careful not to injure any tissue, because that's the area that is important for speech production and speech perception.
Right, so as we get better and better at differentiating the ways these different brain subsystems process different kinds of input, we're starting to build up a clearer data-driven picture of how the modules of the overall system work.
Yeah, and there are these traditional debates between modularity and global aspects or mass action, and of course they're both true as viewpoints, and so now we are looking at both. We have very nice evidence from multiple perspectives and multiple laboratories that there is very precise local information processing going on. I keep on talking about cortex because cortex is so closely associated with conscious contents, but it's not just cortex. This is a huge brain that took hundreds of millions of years to evolve, and it has numerous sophisticated and highly adaptive types of information processing. But cortex is a convenient thing to talk about for a number of reasons.
Right, and although a lot of consciousness research focuses on the cerebral cortex, there are a few other far more ancient, and to me far more intriguing, brain structures that seem to support consciousness, or to really be central to it. And one of those, of course, is the basal ganglia, which date all the way back to our common ancestors with fish. And that raises another question that's fascinated me ever since I was a little kid. Could animals like fish have something we'd recognize as conscious experience? I mean, we all agree that chimps and dogs do, but how far down the evolutionary chain might recognizable conscious experience go?
Yes, that is one of the big surprises that leapt out at me and at other people when we started to make these connections. Suddenly, brain evolution and the neural basis of consciousness in other species really became a headline question. And it turned out, of course, that scientists who work on comparative neurobiology had already studied that question in very great depth. And so there are certain things that seem to be very clear. For example, if we consider the cortex and its twin, the thalamus, which always resonates with specific cortical areas, so they work as a unified system. If we consider the corticothalamic or CT system to be the physiological basis of consciousness in human beings, then let's take a look at primates other than humans And the most widely used experimental animal is the macaque monkey, which has a visual system that is so similar to ours that very often monkey data is used without even talking about the fact that it comes from another species. And we pretend it's human data. Well, that's nonsense, of course. But it is so revealing and informative to look at the monkey visual cortex that you can see people simply skipping over that fact.
I've noticed that too, actually. We use monkeys for studies of the visual system and for a lot of aspects of the cerebral cortex. And a lot of researchers basically treat them as human from a neurological perspective. And to some degree, that's justified. There really is a lot of similarity there. And that's why I'm so curious to see how recognizable conscious experience would be as we go down the evolutionary chain. Like I said, how much of it is really analogous to our conscious experience, like it almost certainly is in monkeys, and how far down the chain would you have to go before it starts to feel really alien?
And then, of course, you proceed in that quest by getting the very best evidence you can. And right now we have the genome, which gives us a direct way of assessing similarities and dissimilarities between species, which creates a great deal of increased confidence that if we're talking about the same genes, we're talking about the same organs, we're talking about the same functions. If we have those three sources of data all converging on the same conclusion, then I think we can certainly talk about consciousness in the macaque and other primates, because primates are so similar. The macaque is a good example. And then, of course, you can look at tiny little monkeys from Central America, and you can ask the question, here's an example of a brain that looks very much like a human brain, except it's the size of a few fingers. And there are studies being done of that kind. That sounds like a very simple question, because now instead of talking about 86 billion neurons, we're talking about 8 billion neurons. And then we can start asking questions about size and compared to body size and so on. The corticothalamic system is such a huge part of the human brain. It's about half the volume in the cranium of the human brain. And the same structure exists in all mammals because it's a distinctively mammalian part of the brain. And mammals go back 200 million years. So suddenly we get this large temporal perspective on the evolution of the part of the brain that is most closely associated with consciousness.
That is really striking. Yeah, right around the time that our evolutionary relatives started to look recognizably primate, they suddenly got this explosion of growth in the brain structures we most associate with consciousness. So there might really be a divide there in terms of what conscious experience was like before versus after that evolutionary growth spurt.
Yes. One of the things that's always seemed obvious to me was that once we have a grasp of consciousness that is empirically solid, and we certainly have that, then there are all kinds of ethical questions that get clarified. So we suddenly have to start wondering, are we mistreating animals? Or are we killing babies who are actually conscious, even though the conventional wisdom has been that fetuses are not conscious? Or on the other end of life, are there people who are in behavioral coma, but who are actually awake in what's called the locked-in syndrome? So suddenly you get an ethical universe that is much larger than ever before. In some cases, that has led to campaigns against ethical experimentation with animals. The particular case that I'm thinking about is of a scientist who works in Germany, a friend of mine, whose name is Nikos. He has a Greek name. His last name is Logothetis. And Science Magazine just had an article about Nikos having had to resign from directing his primate lab at the Max Planck Institute under pressure from people who claim that he abuses animals, which is false. He is extremely sensitive to the well-being of animals, and there are cases, of course, where animals really do suffer in experimental laboratories, and there are all kinds of controls to prevent that from happening in most cases. So that research program has been shut down in Germany essentially because of dishonest and deceptive and unethical assaults on his work. This is a hysterical overreaction. This is a kind of a witch hunt in which the people involved simply don't want to listen. And with that blind kind of pressure, we have now lost perhaps the best laboratory in the world studying consciousness. So this is typical, I think, of several aspects of consciousness science. One of them is that the more we learn about consciousness, the more we can empathize with other conscious beings. The other one is that the truth is that every time we find out more, we also understand that there are ethical trade-offs. There is no way we can stop birds from fighting for their territories, which is much of what they do. There is no way that we can stop cats from crawling into trees and eating the eggs or eating the young of a pair of birds. This is nature, and you can try to control nature and stop it from being so cruel in a very small space at the cost of misunderstanding what really happens in the real world. But that is, I think, one of the emerging mixes of good science together with ethics, and that's something that should be humanly interesting to people.
And this actually provides a perfect segue into the other big topic I wanted to talk to you about today. And that's the topic of the disease of scienciness, which is, of course, how I met you, or why I met you, because I had written an article called A Disease of Scienciness, which you called, quote, the biggest hot button of large numbers of scientists or real science fans. I love that. That hot button being, of course, people who claim to be science lovers, but don't check their sources and post and reshare and retweet sciencey content without having taken any steps at all to find out if it's even true. Which, you know, for a science lover, a self-described science lover, is not very loving towards science. And you, Bernard, actually have a nonprofit organization, the Society for Mind-Brain Sciences, which is largely dedicated to stamping out misinformation about science, especially neuroscience, which you say is one of the most important goals, maybe the most important goal, in science communication with the public, and I completely agree with that. How do you think scienciness became such a big problem in the first place? How did pop science become so totally divorced from real science?
You know, it's an interesting question. I don't fully understand. Obviously, we have a workforce of millions of people in the sciences and people who love the sciences as a topic, as a hobby, whatever, and who read excellent books. There are wonderful general audience books that give us real insight. I mean, I read those books for parts of science that I do not understand based on my personal studies. There is excellent science literature out there, but the popular science headlines are almost always false. And because people in the sciences are very often very dedicated, and they feel after 10 or 20 or 30 years of working away at something and actually finding things out, that they have interesting news to tell the world, and important news for medical reasons and many other reasons. And yet nobody's listening, and very often journalists are not interested because they wrongly believe that it's incomprehensible. And of course, that's nonsense. There are lots of excellent science writers who manage to make it comprehensible, and I don't think we should be satisfied with scienciness, as you put it, rather than science in the popular media.
I agree that we shouldn't put up with pop science reporting that blurs and often even distorts the facts. All anyone has to do, it's not that much, is just take a few minutes on Google before you reblog or retweet an article and just check how is that discovery being reported on sites like, for example, Science Daily and Scientific American, or just by newspapers that actually check their facts. It's not hard to take 30 seconds and just check whether you're misinforming your friends or not. And interestingly, when my article went viral, the response from the science community was universally positive. The negative feedback that I got came entirely from people who weren't scientists and who weren't even particularly avid science fans. These were people who wanted carte blanche to share whatever pop science stories they came across, regardless of accuracy, and they expected the scientific community to thank them for that. Now, luckily, though, a lot of science fans do not sink that low. Many people really do care whether the stories they're sharing are accurate or not, and that's great. That's awesome. What advice would you have for those people who really do care about sharing the truth?
Yeah, these days, of course, it is so easy because, well, first of all, I understand from a guy named Levine, I can't remember his first name, who is the head of a science writers group in New York City. I understand from him that very often it is accepted in that community to simply use press releases from the various universities and research institutions and so on, and simply take the word of the PR people of what has been found in some particular lab at a particular university and so on. That is grossly irresponsible because press releases are puff pieces and they're written by people who really don't care about the underlying truth because they are paid by the headline or something similar to that, and the headlines are always the same. Surprise, we just have made a major step forward toward understanding consciousness because we found a particular neuron in the brain that does something when people are conscious. And that's always interesting if it's a fact, but then you have to put it in a context. And that's what good science writers, of course, do, and what not so good science writers consistently fail to do. The similarity between different PR stories is just stunning if you look at Eureka Alert, which is a running news wire, in a sense, of hot stories in science, according to the PR people. Generally, the structure of the story follows one or two different narratives. The discovery narrative is one of them. Oops, we were wrong is another one. And it does not serve the audience to constantly come up with unjustified stories that are essentially imaginary and have little or nothing to do with the actual work that's done.
So people just need to look for context. Sure, because it's true. Press releases and poorly researched articles based on them often blow discoveries way out of proportion. And somebody has to take a step back and ask, okay, what does this research actually show? And that doesn't take expertise in the field. It just takes a willingness to check the context.
Exactly. And the frustration on the science side is very often, I know somebody at the institute where I worked for most recently, the Neuroscience Institute in San Diego and La Jolla, who was one of the discoverers of molecules called microRNAs. MicroRNAs were thought to be floating around the cell without having specific functions. So they were thought of as kind of trash molecules that you wanted to get rid of. And now it turns out that microRNAs are an enormous domain of very functional molecules in the cell and certainly can give us answers that are very relevant to medical questions, to all kinds of very, very basic questions. So microRNAs are a big deal. But I believe that discovery, which by now is 10 years old, has simply not been told in the major media, especially in this day and age when the excellent science is coming in so quickly. We're sitting on treasures, and everybody in science, or most people at least, are eager to talk about their work, to explain it, to get everybody excited about these breakthrough discoveries. And your average popular science writer just isn't interested.
So, consciousness and accurate science communication, both topics about which you and I, Bernard, are both hugely passionate. And although we're running out of time right now, there is so much more that I would like to talk to you about. So I'm sure we're going to have you back on the show soon to dig into this stuff even more. But for now, thanks again, Bernard Baars, for joining us on the Connectome Podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure. And for everyone listening out there, we've got lots more thrilling interviews coming up soon. Stay tuned. Until next time, have a great week, everybody. Go do some science!